There is a dark irony in the names we give our vessels. We name them Victory, Hope, or Discovery. But in 1845, the British Royal Navy prepared 2 ships for the most dangerous journey on Earth, and they gave them names that would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. HMS Erebus, named after the Greek god of darkness and shadow, and HMS Terror, named after the spirit of fear, darkness and terror. On May 19, 1845, these 2 black ships sat on the River Thames. They looked invincible, but looking back, they look like coffins waiting to be nailed shut. It was the golden age of the Empire. Science and steam were conquering the world. 10,000 people lined the banks of the river to wave them goodbye. The atmosphere was electric. This wasn't just an expedition, it was the Victorian equivalent of the moon landing. Leading them was Sir John Franklin. At 59 years old, he was too old for the Arctic. But he was a hero, a man who had eaten his own boots to survive a previous expedition. He stood on the deck waving his hat. He wasn't looking for danger, he was looking for glory. He believed, like everyone else, that the Arctic was just a map waiting to be drawn. And why shouldn't they be confident? The Erebus and the Terror were technological marvels. They were bomb vessels, reinforced with layers of iron and oak so thick they could smash through solid ice. But inside, they were palaces. They had steam locomotives installed in their hulls to power propellers, a new technology. They had a library of 2,900 books. They had fine china, crystal glasses, and silverware. Most amazingly, they had a central heating system using hot water pipes. The plan was to bring the comfort of a London gentleman's club to the frozen ends of the earth. To feed 129 men for 3 years, they packed a mountain of food: flour, rum, tobacco, and chocolate, and 8,000 tins of preserved meat and soup. It seemed like a feast that would never end. But in the rush to leave, nobody checked the factory that made the tins. Nobody noticed the sloppy soldering. Nobody saw the lead dripping into the food. Before they even left the harbor, the seeds of madness were already stowed in the cargo hold. July 1845. The ships were spotted by whalers in Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to open. The captains wrote their final letters home. "All is well," they said. "Don't worry about us." The whalers watched the black sails of the Erebus and Terror move slowly towards the horizon. They sailed into the White Labyrinth, and they were never seen by white men again. September 1846. Off the coast of King William Island. The crew waited for the summer thaw. They waited for the sea to open up. But the summer never came. The temperature dropped to -50 degrees. The ocean froze solid. The ice didn't just surround the ships, it attacked them. It squeezed the hulls of the Erebus and Terror with the force of a tectonic plate. The ships groaned. The massive oak beams screamed under the pressure. They were no longer ships. They were wooden prisons, locked in concrete made of salt water. Then the sun went down, and it didn't rise again for 3 months. The Arctic winter brought a darkness so complete it felt heavy. The steam engines were shut down to save coal. The lights went out. Imagine the silence. 129 men trapped in the dark, thousands of miles from the nearest human settlement. The only sound was the wind howling through the rigging and the terrifying crack of the ice pressing against their beds. Time lost its meaning. There was no day, there was no night, only the watch. It was in this darkness that the dying started. It shouldn't have happened yet. They had enough food. They were young, strong men. But on January 1st, John Torrington, a 20-year-old stoker, fell ill. He grew thin. His skin turned gray. He coughed until he couldn't breathe. He died on New Year's Day. Then John Hartnell died. Then William Braine. The doctors were confused. They wrote pneumonia or tuberculosis in the logbooks. But young men don't just drop dead like flies. Something else was happening. Something invisible. They took the bodies to a small strip of land called Beachy Island. To dig a grave in the Arctic, you have to chip away at rock-hard ice. It took days. They dressed the boys in their best shirts. They placed them in coffins, and they buried them deep in the permafrost. The ice is cruel, but it is also a preserver. When scientists dug up these graves 140 years later, they found something terrifying. John Torrington didn't look like a skeleton. He looked like he was sleeping. The ice had frozen him in time perfectly. His eyes were still open, staring at a future that he would never see. While the men froze in the darkness, a silent assassin was moving among them. It was hiding in the most unlikely place: their food. The 8,000 tins of soup and meat which they ate every single day were sealed with lead solder. Lead is a neurotoxin. It is a slow poison. Every time they opened a tin, flakes of lead fell into the food. Day by day, week by week, the metal accumulated in their blood. They thought they were eating to survive. In reality, they were poisoning themselves with every spoonful. The first symptom of lead poisoning is not physical. It is mental. By the second winter, the atmosphere on the ships changed. Discipline began to break down. Brave men became paranoid. Officers started to hear whispers in the empty corridors. They suffered from hallucinations. The ship was no longer just a prison, it was becoming an asylum floating on ice. Then came the Black Death of the Sea, scurvy. We think of scurvy as just a vitamin deficiency, but it is a horror story. Without vitamin C, the body stops producing collagen. It literally falls apart. Their gums turned black and swelled until they covered their teeth. Old broken bones, healed years ago, suddenly snapped again. Scars from childhood cuts opened up and began to bleed. They were rotting from the inside out. June 1847. The ice should have melted, but another summer passed and the white grip did not loosen. And then the ultimate blow. Sir John Franklin, the leader, the father figure of the expedition, died. We don't know how. Maybe the lead, maybe the cold, maybe a broken heart. He was buried in the ice, leaving Captain Crozier in command of a fleet of ghosts. 3 winters. 3 years stuck in the ice. The coal was gone. The food was running low. The men were dying. Captain Crozier looked at the horizon. He knew the ships would never sail again. He made a decision that doomed them all. We walk. April 22nd, 1848. Good Friday. Captain Crozier gave the final order. Abandon ships! 105 surviving men climbed over the railings of the Erebus in terror for the last time. They looked back at their wooden homes, now tombstones trapped in the ice. They were leaving the only shelter they had known for 3 years. Ahead of them lay a 1,000-mile walk to the nearest trading post in Canada. They were walking into oblivion. 3 days later, they reached the shore of King William Island. Here, they left the only written record that has ever been found, the famous Victory Point Note. It was a standard Admiralty form, first filled out a year earlier, full of optimism. But in the margins, in scribbled, desperate handwriting, Captain Crozier wrote the final entry. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. The total loss by deaths in the expedition has been 9 officers and 15 men. It was not a progress report. It was an obituary. This is where the lead poisoning revealed its true horror, not just in their bodies, but in their minds. They had to pack light to survive, but when archaeologists found their abandoned sledges years later, they were shocked by what they were carrying. They didn't just pack food, they packed heavy silver cutlery with the officers' initials. They packed brass curtain rods, desk accessories, books, even a backgammon board. Why haul tons of useless metal across the frozen ocean while starving to death? Because their brains were broken. They were clinging to civilization in a place that demanded savagery. They loaded heavy wooden lifeboats onto sledges. Each one weighed over a ton. There were no dogs, there were no horses. The men harnessed themselves to the ropes. This is called man-hauling. The ice wasn't flat. It was a chaotic landscape of sharp ridges and deep snow. They pulled for 10 hours a day. Sometimes they moved only a few miles. They were burning 6,000 calories a day, but eating only a handful of moldy biscuits. The march became a slow execution. Men began to drop in their tracks. At first, they tried to bury them. Then, they just left them where they fell. The local Inuit people saw them. They described a column of walking skeletons moving south, leaving a trail of corpses behind them. The discipline vanished. The officers lost control, and as the last scraps of food ran out, the men looked at each other and saw the only meat left in the Arctic. When hunger reaches a certain point, the rules of civilization evaporate. Morality is a luxury for the well-fed. As the last biscuits were eaten, the men of the Franklin expedition crossed a line from which there is no return. They looked at the bodies of their dead friends and saw food. For over a century, the British Navy denied it. They called it a lie. British sailors would never do such a thing, they said. But the ice does not lie, and neither do the bones. In the 1990s, scientists analyzed the bones found at the final campsites. They found knife marks, not the marks of animals gnawing on skeletons, but precise surgical cuts made by steel blades, cuts designed to remove muscle from bone. They even found signs of pot polishing, bones that had been boiled in metal kettles to extract the marrow. The local Inuit hunters watched in horror. They told stories of a group of 40 white men who made a camp near the mouth of the Back River. They said the men were falling down and dying as they walked. Later, when the Inuit returned to the camp, they found boots filled with cooked human flesh. They found a pile of skulls. The men had tried to survive by consuming the dead, but it only prolonged their agony for a few more days. Imagine being the last one, the last survivor of 129 men. Everyone around you is dead. The silence is absolute. You are hundreds of miles from home, holding a loaded shotgun, waiting for an end that you know is coming. They call the final resting place Starvation Cove. Not a single man made it out of the ice. The strongest navy on Earth was defeated not by a war, not by a monster, but by nature itself. The snow covered their bodies. The wind erased their footprints. And for 170 years, the Arctic kept their secret.